so I'm going to try to stop saying now. Anyway, I'm an interim specialist within the Presbyterian Church and now apparently within the Lutheran Church, or at least within the Synod of Metro DC by invitation of your bishop. And I hate it when I do that. I am here to work with you over the next few months during your transition from your former pastor to whoever will be your new pastor. And there's a lot I could chat about, but why don't we just cut to the chase and see if you all have any questions. Is there anything you'd like to ask about?
Joe, what is the necessary steps we have to complete before we can begin a call?
I would say there's a number of them, but what springs to my mind first are looking at the issues of leadership, staffing, and creating a vision of the future. Where does the council see this church going? And if you're like most places where you've had a long-term pastor, and I suspect that you are, you're used to a lot of these decisions being made by the pastor. And it gets communicated to the council and the congregation through this wonderful kind of osmotic process that no one can really say how it works. But it just does, and we all know it does because we're here 40 years later and look around us, Obviously, somebody somewhere had a vision. And usually that resides with the pastor. So in the interim period, I think it's a wonderful time for council, for the leadership board of the congregation, whatever that's called, to look at its own leadership and how do we want in the future to be leaders of the congregation. Do we want to emphasize our leadership? Do we want to de-emphasize it? What do we want to do with it? If you don't know where you're going, then you don't know whether the wind blowing the sail is a good wind or an ill wind. To take that metaphor and use it in your situation, if you don't know where you're going, how do you know the kind of pastor you're looking for? What skills do you need? Do you want somebody that's a really good preacher, that's a theologian? Do you want someone who's more of an academic? Do you want somebody who's more of a pastor in terms of visiting and socializing with people? And as I go down the list, I'm sure everybody's going, yeah, well, I want that, and yeah, I want that, yeah, I want that. The problem with that is that manifesting that in an individual is often very difficult. I tend to lean towards academics, which makes me, Myers-Briggs, personality inventory-wise, a little bit of an introvert. I have a friend who does not lean so much towards academics, but is really, really good at socializing. Go through and do small talk with people all day. I'm rotten at that. And you're going to find that generally, I think, is going to be true about people. We have skills that we excel in and things that we do okay, and other things we don't do well at all. And that's all of us. So if the council and the congregation gets in their minds, well, we're looking for somebody that can just do it all and do it really, really well, you're probably going to be disappointed. So part of my job is to be the person that obviously can't do it all well, so you can get used to that. Because certainly your former pastor did everything perfectly. Does that help?
Yeah. The real question is, when do we expect to start the call?
That's pretty much up to your council, and I think your bishop in consultation with each other. My sense would be somewhere 6 to 8 months down the road, give or take a week. Because to look at where you're going, you need to look at where you've been and reflect on that some. To talk about what kind of skills do we want, you need to reflect on what have we done. What was our former pastor good at? Do we need those things all over? And one of the things that I think your former pastor really was good at and enjoyed doing was building buildings and maintaining buildings. My first experience of your pastor was he was in this room, cuddled over some papers, trying to find some kind of a part number for an air conditioner that he was fixing. And my first thought was, well, I hope nobody expects me to fix an air conditioner. That would not be a good thing. So, part of what goes on for me is to allow the congregation some time to recover from the loss of the pastor. I think particularly here, after 40 years of being with the founding pastor, that loss is pretty significant. And you've got people, as it's been expressed to me by members of your congregation, who are ready to get on down the road, and some who are not. So, when does the council think we're ready to do this? And is the council ready and prepared to say, here's where we want to go, these are the skills we're looking for, this is what we're going to need, we've got our congregation on board with us, and we're all heading in the same direction. I'm not sure you're there yet. And I think it just takes a little while to do this. And for me, there's an appropriate metaphor of grief and loss. If you look at somebody who's been married for a long time, and a spouse dies, if you just go out and start dating again real quickly, at the urging of friends and family, go on, get out there, you can wind up getting yourself in a relationship you're just not ready for. And that's not, I would assume, that is not what you folks want to do. You want to make sure you're ready to engage a new pastor, to be engaged with a new pastor, before you get to the point of having that new pastor move in. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does, but many of us are retired military.
Mm-hmm.
We've attended churches all over America, and we've changed pastors frequently when we did that. And we still held our faith and still enjoyed the congregations we were a part of.
Yeah.
So I don't see that much difference between what we're doing then and now, at least from my perspective.
And I think the difference is that not everybody is military from my point of view. And that there's a difference between being in a congregation of military people and seeing yourself as being transient. And maybe I'm wrong, maybe you don't want to build a sense of permanence here. That's my sense of it, that your congregation is about permanence. And I think one of the things I've heard is people telling me stories of we're in the military or retired military. We left and came back, but retained our membership here. So I would urge you to look at what does that mean to me? That when I left, I didn't leave here. I kept my membership here, and I participated in other congregations, but my membership was here. Was that experience providing you the stability that allowed you to function well in another congregation where you were participating but not a member? These are things that matter to us as human beings in the realm of my experience. It may not be as significant to you or some other folks here, but I do think it's important to ask the question: if I'm ready to move forward, is the rest of my family also ready to move forward? And then going back to the metaphor, when a spouse dies, sometimes the surviving spouse will have a relationship, and that person's children are not ready for that person to have the relationship. You may have experienced that yourself. I certainly have in my life. And I think that metaphor applies to this kind of transition also. Because that's all we're talking about is transition. Yes, ma'am.
Well, maybe this is a question better posed to my fellow congregation members. Has the church council started doing any of this reflecting and whatever? And how are we doing on that?
Well, I can speak for myself.
I was hoping you'd stand up, Mark.
We haven't done anything formal per se so far. Actually, Joe's been here got here in August, got settled in September, just getting started. The other the other challenge is having time for the council to get together and do things as a council between the schedule here at St. Matthew's and our own schedule. So Joe was having us reading a book thinking about the church, what we're doing in the church. he was ready for us to do this already, probably. I think coming out of that, the council as a group will have a better idea of how we want to attack things. I can just tell you personally, I have had 3 long conversations with Joe. I've got about 3 or 4 things that I've already got in my own mind of what I think we need to look at during the transition period. And Ted may well be right, we can do this quicker than we think we can. I am, maybe because I'm slow moving, I'm concerned that we don't move too quickly. I was talking about the bishop before we brought Joe on, we were talking about the transition period. And I talked about, because I'm a PK, so I've been through that. My own dad had to go through those processes. And I said, back in the old days, we'd have someone come in, but essentially they were, I think Joe's mentioned, essentially they're holding the place together until you call the new person. You might call that person fairly rapidly. And the bishop said, yeah. And that guy you called, he was your pastor. He was the guy. Because when you finally did figure out what you wanted to do, the pastor you called you thought was permanent wasn't the right pastor. And you weren't the right fit for him.
And the stats on that phenomenon are relatively high. And there is a correlation between the longer your outgoing pastor has stayed, the more difficult it is in the transition. So the higher the number of people who don't make it through the first 3 to 5 years as the installed pastor, because, as Mark said, they were de facto the unnamed interim. And I would suggest you really don't want to do that. That takes the wind out of your sails. As a congregation, it's demoralizing to have a break with somebody. It's easier to take all of your grief and wrath out on the interim who's just going to move through anyway. Let me make sure Mark had said everything that he needs to say.
Someone has a question for me.
I have a question for you. I have a request of you. Between Pastor Reggin and the council, you come up with a timeline of what's going to happen, about when you think it's going to happen, or at least the elements that you're going to employ to get to the position that you say you feel like would be healthy for us. So that we can have some sense of, this is what we're buying, not buying, that's a bad choice. This is what we're committing to corporately here, and give us a better feel for what it is we're doing. We only lost 1 pastor out of 3. We weren't like it was a plane crash and the whole team was lost. So if that's possible, that would be very helpful.
And that goes back to a question that I had. Are you going to call a pastor head of staff, which is one kind of animal, or are you going to call a co-pastor, which is a different kind of animal?
Why would we want to do that?
I'm sorry?
I just said interesting.
Yeah.
Well, that's a good question, Joe, because
With timeline and everything else, I would find it interesting if you shared your insights and the council's insights that you acquire as a result of all this, the retreat you're going to, and what you figure out before, so that we know where we're going as far as, maybe that helps us to know who you're going to call.
It would be my expectation, if I may, that you will see a huge rise in the level of communication from the council to the congregation over the next few months. And that will stay in place maybe from now on. I don't know. It depends on how your council and your congregation feel about it. But a lot of communication will come from the council about what they're doing. And if I may, the average time for an interim is 18 to 24 months. Average time. So if you're really quick, 12 to 14.
Mark, I think the question a little bit, even from the council, but even when the council feels they're going to get to a call committee, of which I think in our Constitution, everything else, the call committee is comprised of at least several members that aren't members of the council.
Right.
So therefore, the congregation does have an input into this whole
Absolutely.
discussion as it's going forward.
Absolutely.
As a matter of fact, only one council.
At least one.
Yes, sir. Let me get this gentleman and we'll come back if I may. Yes, sir.
Mark, I would just ask that, as you guys consider what sorts of mechanisms you want to use to kind of generate the information that you're looking for to see who's the next person in, that you really give us an opportunity for two things. First of all, an opportunity for written input, however that's done, whether that's a survey or just looking for love letters or whatever it is you're looking for. The second thing is to have small groups of a dozen or less open to anybody who wants to attend, so that we get an opportunity to kind of express ideas back and forth to see whether you get any positive feedback from others, see whether you're the only lone goat out there who thinks that's an important item. Because I think if it gets down just to the 4 or 5 people on the call committee, at some point, I think you lose something, and at least the input from the whole body.
Two things you mentioned are kind of like part of the process that we're looking at. We don't do the call committee until we have something to give the call committee so they know what the congregation wants.
Understood.
That's what
Actually, my question was going to be how you anticipate getting input from the congregation and you
that's about
he gave you 2 ideas, so.
I'm sure the council's getting a lot of input from the congregation. Whether or not it comes in a form that's helpful is a different issue. But, and organizing to get this and to process the data that you have is also part of it. It just takes time. You know, if you had a council that didn't have lives and spouses and children and other things to do, you could probably get this done in 6 to 8 months. But your council has other stuff to do. They're busy like everybody else here. And they can just, get to it when they can get to it. It was an interesting task to find a weekend when all of these people could be together. And I'm still not sure we've got that.
No, you're not successful.
Yeah, we probably will have to have a secondary
We'll
weekend.
have to be, probably.
And I'm used to that. Hopefully we can schedule the next one with enough lead time that everybody can be in the same room at the same time. So, yes, sir.
Are we still talking about a specific position that has a label on it, a senior label? And does that necessarily exclude the pastors that we have? Or are we looking for a senior person that come in and, for those of us that were in the military at general levels, person? Or what are we looking for? It hasn't been described to me yet what we're looking for.
Dick, I think that's one of the things we are going to have to work out as a congregation, because that's not a decision that's up to a handful of people. That has to be all of our decision. So, we have to be clear as a congregation of which direction we want to be going.
Well, I agree. We have to be clear. And that as far as I'm concerned right now, we don't even know what the options are.
Because they haven't discussed them.
Yeah.
We're working on it.
The council hasn't come to the point of having a discussion. I think they're getting ready to have it. They haven't had it yet. And again, that's just because as far as I know, the
visitors when
council-
they have it.
I'm sorry?
I hope they have visitors when they have their.
I hope they have visitors all the time. I hope you folks come to the council meetings as a regular practice to observe and listen and ask questions. Yes, ma'am.
When we've been talking about getting feedback from the congregation, during Brandon's vicar year here, we did a very extensive survey. Brandon, that was part of his project, right? And presenting that to all the different committees that input. So we have, I would think that we should look at that survey also, because that was quite intense and gave us a lot of feedback and information to each of the surveys. So that information we already have. And we did look at different things. Granted, Pastor Bohannon was still here. The other point I wanted to make is the transition did not start when Pastor Bohannon's last Sunday here. We've been preparing for this over the last couple of years. So maybe which was why we have had Brandon in place, so that the programs and Tari in place, that we could continue on in this interim. So it's not like it just started. We've been on the road a little bit, and we just start his last Sunday.
Right. Yes, ma'am.
I would suggest too, and this may not have been included by what Mark was saying or other ways of giving information, but I have a sense in conversations that I have had with regard to the day school and on the property committee and the evangelism committee, that there are already shifts and visions, not scary visions, that have already been discussed just a little bit to the right or the left or the up or down of what we've done before. So I think that will happen naturally in the committees, and I would suggest that the committees, have some role in that, maybe some designated role in that, to bring how they would have their little purview adjusted to take into consideration what we're going to look for going forward. Because it isn't that this is ground to a halt. It isn't that Pastor Bohannon did everything. The committees did a great deal. And so there's a lot of wisdom there. There are a lot of things that we tried and abandoned or adjusted. And I think that needs to come in the committees.
And getting that organized will take a little time, probably.
Well, I think it'll just happen.
Yeah.
If the council person that's on the committee, will take the input of the committee to the council, then it would be a kind of a natural progression. But I think it's something that should be recognized as a
Let's go here, and then there was somebody over here. Yes, ma'am.
Well, this dovetails with what you said, Mayor Catherine, and you, and also something that you said a few minutes ago. And my sense is that, my experience is there is a lot of differentiation in this congregation, which makes my heart sing. And a lot of salt and light, a lot of differentiation is probably the best way to put it. But something that you said that I jumped with when you said the pastor was perfect. And oh wow, not my experience.
You do realize I was being a little facetious.
Yes. But I also think that it seems also important to put words on it, is that because it does relate to the flow of seeing the transition coming and the development of differentiation as there has been. You said Dave Bohannon is so finite and broad and visible about it. If he wasn't, Christine was. I hope I'm not saying anything.
We can't hear you. I'm sorry.
Oh, well, I was talking about just how Dave Bohannon lived, kind of in a finite, flawed, visible way, and so, yeah. So it seemed important to say that, and I think that there's a lot of experience of that may be more widely distributed in the congregation. We're military also, more widely distributed in this congregation among this group of people than I've ever witnessed before. And so, it seems important to say that.
Okay. Somebody over here. Yes, ma'am.
Kathy brought up a really good point that I've not been able to really wrap my head around. Dave didn't decide on the 29th of July that was going to be his last day. We've been preparing for this for such a long time. Why aren't we further along in the preparation process? Because I really think there was a breakdown somewhere. I think we should be, much farther
I'm not sure you're wasting time. That would be the first point I would want to make. The other point I would want to make is to invite you to listen to what you just said. If I heard you correctly, you're saying, well, we were prepared for this and we were ready for this, so we should have just been going along, but we haven't. Somewhere there was a breakdown. So what I hear in that, if I've heard this correctly, again, is either we weren't as prepared as we thought we were, or we were prepared, but only in the context of our former pastor still functioning in the role. When people say to me, and I've heard this many, many places, Pastor X got us ready for this. I hear that in the same way as I hear somebody saying, well, I'm going to break up with my spouse, but I'm going to help get them ready for it before I do. You really can't. Because as long as you're functioning in that role of pastor, and I think David was until 3 or 4 days after he was gone, the congregation doesn't really have the sense, nor the council, of what is it like for you not to be here because you have not been not here. The dynamics, the relationships all change. Same thing happens in families, where there's somebody who is in a long-term illness and they die. Yes, we can do preliminary grief. But the reality is that as long as Dad or Grandpa or whoever it is available to us, even just the physical person, then we have a focus for ourselves as a family. It isn't until that person dies that some of the bigger issues hit. For example, most people don't start arguing about who gets Dad's golf clubs until after Dad has died. We save that. And I think you folks have a few golf clubs to talk about, because you have very different people here.
Pastor.
Yes, sir.
Joe. We have a pastoral staff here. We have 2 excellent pastors.
No question.
This was not just Dave's church.
Right.
And what I'm hearing is that it's all about Dave, Pastor Bohannon. We have Pastor Tar's been with us 12 plus years or 13 years, as long as I'm 20. I'm sorry. We got a fantastic pastor, Pastor Brandon. And my involvement here at the church, even though I'm not on council, I do other things, is that we've, Dave, the way he administered, the way he took care of his flock was that it was distributed.
Right.
It's a responsibility of the council. Dave was our shepherd. Right. We have other shepherds. We have 2 other very, very strong and capable pastors. Right. And I keep hearing this, that we've got this big loss, we've got this big death, that Dave is gone. 2/3 of us are military. And we're used to the change. And I'm not speaking for everyone, I'm speaking for myself now. Right. But I keep hearing that we got this big death, this big mourning. Dave is gone. His presence will always be here. But we have a fantastic pastoral staff, and we have a fantastic council with a lot of people that have a lot of longevity here. Mm-hmm. And it's not a church out maybe in Missouri somewhere where there's 50, 60 parishioners that are, been there for 80, 90 years.